Good afternoon, colleagues. Welcome back. I hope you've enjoyed or you are enjoying the parallel sessions. My name is Bongani Nyoka. I'm part of the LOC, and I'll be chairing the second plenary to be delivered by Professor Shireen Hassim. Prof. Hassim will have 40 minutes to address us. And please, colleagues, use the chat function to send comments and questions, and I will fill them on behalf of Professor Hassim. So our colleague Nomphumelelo Babeli will introduce Professor Hassim. So Mpumi, take it away.
Good day, everybody. With us today, it gives me great honor to introduce our next keynote speaker, Professor Shireen Hassim. Professor Shireen Hassim is a researcher and also an author, but she's also a Canada 150 research chair at the Gender and African Politics at Carleton University in Canada. She was previously a professor at the Political Studies at the University of Witwatersrand, and also spent a year as a distinguished and a visiting professor at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard at the United States of America. Professor Hassim is an authority on feminist theory, social movements, and collective action, and she has written and edited several books, including No Shortcuts to Power, African Women in Politics and Policymaking, and Go Home or Go Die, Violence, Xenophobia, and Reinvention of Difference in South Africa, and most recently, Voices of Liberation, Fatima Mia. Professor Shireen Hassim today will be joining our panel and be talking about rethinking crisis through the social, some dilemmas for South African politics. I will now give over the platform to Professor Shireen Hassim.
Thank you so much, Nomphumelelo, and thank you to Sally and Bongani as well. I really do appreciate this invitation, and I feel desperately sorry to be stuck far away from home and not able to be in South Africa as a result of various border closures and pandemic-related constraints on travel. So it also means that I'm not able to attend many of the panels that look fantastic. Most of them happen in the middle of the night for me, and I just don't feel able to get up at that time. So thank you, though, for inviting me, and thank you everyone for coming to this talk. I always feel like keynote addresses have to be quite fully worked out, path-breaking and new ideas, and mostly I want to return to some older ideas and to kind of refocus our attention a little bit on questions that I think are important. I want to begin with something I read on the News 24 site last week, which kind of made an impression on me and remains with me as something that we need to think about. So this little snippet, amidst all the stories of the collapse of the ANC and Esma Gashule and whether Jacob Zuma will appear in court or not, here was this little snippet from the Gauteng legislature, in which responding to a question from the DA, the legislature was told that in the year between April 2020 and March 2021, almost 20,000 babies were born to mothers under the age of 19. Of that number, 934 babies were born to girls between the ages of 10 and 14. 934 in one province, born to children between the ages of 10 and 14. The age of consent, I need not remind you, is 16. I dug a little bit more into this because it seemed to me this tiny little story should was fairly shocking. In 2018, the total number of births to girls between the ages of 10 and 14 in the whole country was 1,287. So, compared to a year later, 934 in one province. So I'm opening with this example, not really to call on your outrage, although, indeed, I do wonder why there are no mass movements rising up to address rape, because this is statutory rape and other forms of gender-based violence. Why is it only embattled feminists who worry about this and who talk about this and who try to mobilize against it? But I'm not really wanting to mobilize outrage. I'm raising it because I think these stories tell us something about South Africa outside of the media cycle of party politics, elite wealth accumulation, the Zondo Commission, and so on. And I read that as I was thinking about this talk, and I wondered, is this a crisis? If it is, what kind of a crisis is it? What is it a crisis of? If it's not a crisis, why is it not a crisis? Why are we not talking about those as matters of crisis? And what would be the appropriate terms in which we might begin to talk about that as a crisis? Now, obviously it's not a crisis in the sense, I think, intended by the title of the conference. I suspect that title has multiple other reference to political crises in their many dimensions in South Africa, to economic crisis, perhaps, maybe also to international crises such as war, and most likely, of course, to the COVID-19 pandemic. And so we do have all of these significant failures. We have failures of representation, of accountability, failures of state capability, failures of economic development, of the capacity of the economy to provide jobs and basic goods and services. And I think it is absolutely crucial that we attend to all those failings. But those are not the only failings. So the other thing that occurred to me about crisis is how ubiquitous the word is for those of us in South Africa, right? We use it so quickly, so readily, that it is in danger of becoming banal. It has become a kind of more or less permanent state for us without any seeming resolution either way. There's neither a stabilization of some kind of existing system, nor does crisis in South Africa become a catalyst for a new set of conditions. And I'm going to do the same. I'm going to expand the meanings of crisis and make it even more banal to some extent, because I want to talk about the conditions that give rise to children who are 10 to 14 years old, girls having babies. I want to use the word crisis, drawing on a different kind of literature, not the more familiar Gramscian tradition that we have seen in South African analysis. I want to draw on a different kind of body of literature to illuminate these, what I think of as neglected sets of questions about the relationship between the social and the political. And I want to go beyond the way in which on the left, the social appears in conversations in a way that reductively centers race as the most problematic fracture, through discussions like the national question. I want to draw particularly on the work, and I'm drawing in a kind of eclectic way on many other literatures, on the work of Lauren Berlant, who makes a very helpful distinction between crisis ordinary. Crisis ordinary is what she refers to as the repetitive and familiar tasks of balancing a range of demands in the private sphere, and crisis extraordinary being, in a sense, what we're living through with the pandemic, exceptional public emergencies. Crisis extraordinary is that, she says, which interrupts ordinary life. They say crisis extraordinary is that which interrupts ordinary life and brings us together in the public sphere in a way that is intense and intimate. It binds us together in a common set of problems because we are all collectively experiencing some kind of shift that impacts on every single one of us in the everyday ordering of society. So crisis extraordinary is a moment of political possibility. It is a moment, I think, very akin to what we are living through now. We do have a pandemic that affects us all in everyday ways, regardless of where we are placed in the economic and social structure. But how we will make that into a moment of political possibility, or if you want to draw on Arundhati Roy, make it a portal into an alternative future, seems to be very open-ended. I think as political scientists, what we try to do, or at least what we are called upon to do, is to make sense of the present. That is perhaps where we are most likely to make an entry into public conversations. And so how do we make sense of this presence, and how do we transform this into a moment of political possibility? So first, let me lay out a couple of propositions about the social so that you understand where I'm coming from and the way in which I'm using it. In 14 minutes, I can't really do justice to a full genealogy of the word social, of its uses in sociology and its intersections in political sociology. But in general, I'm taking social to refer to that conceptual space outside of the formal spheres of the political and the economic, the arena in which we relate to each other, the arena in which we create meanings and identifications, and the arena in which we, in a sense, come together through acts of sociality, through dispositions and habits and preferences, and in investments that may encompass both dispositions of care towards each other, or just as easily encompass forms of group closure, forms of turning away from larger questions of care. So I think of the social as the sphere in which our fates are linked in specific ways shaped by our political and economic contexts. And I'm thinking about social here as encompassing the kinds of institutions through which we articulate our sociality. So I include in the social the arrangements we make and we resource through the fiscus, such as welfare, health, transport. Now, for as Nomphumelelo said, I'm very deeply located in feminist theory, and feminists have long been interested in the social. In feminist theory, depending on which strand you draw on, the social has multiple meanings. It's the space in which heteronormative ideologies are naturalized. It is the first arena of primitive accumulation, and it is the first enslavement almost of people, of women, and appropriation of their bodies for labor. It's the space in which particular naturalization of women's tasks is used to expropriate and subsidize profits in the capitalist system. It's a space of unrecognized injustices, such as normalized familial violence. These are all the kind of dark sides of the social. But feminists also point out the other side of these relations. It's a space in which care for each other is most fully articulated. It is, in contexts of slavery and racism. It is the refuge from the injustices of the world of paid labor and racial exploitation. And it has also been for feminists the space from which to launch a politics of justice, to repoliticize the inequalities that are otherwise normalized. More theoretically precise renderings will use social as a kind of qualifier. It will talk of social institutions, social norms, social reproduction, social wage, social provisioning, but I'm reaching for the purposes of this talk for a much broader usage in which all of these are encompassed to varying degrees. In Northern political analysis and sociological analysis, ever since Margaret Thatcher's infamous statement that there is no society, the social has really come to be seen as a signifier of the neoliberal turn, right? The encroachment of market relations from the economy into all areas of life. In Wendy Brown's excellent book, In the Ruins of Neoliberalism, for example, in which she lays out the three key features of neoliberalism. It is the dissolution of the social and the reorientation to what she calls a de-democratized sociality, forms of sociality in which it is individuals engaging with each other through digital means with very little accountability to each other, a very thin form of sociality. For her, the social is one of the three features that most clearly denotes the workings of neoliberalism. The other two in her formulation are the loss of the nation state as the organizing form and the rise of finance capital. In the South African context, until recently, I think the question of the social was addressed in two main ways. In the mainstream of South African politics, it was used as a way to signal a conservative anxiety about the collapse of law and order via a range of moral panics. And in fact, the example I open with about children having babies can easily become the basis of a moral panic about teenage pregnancy, about the breakdown of the family, about wayward mothers or violent fathers. So we've seen from the perspective of the state and the ANC, interventions such as the moral regeneration movement. The AIDS pandemic really was the apogee of this trend, a moment in which sex and sexuality dominated in the public sphere, but really, as Deborah Posel's work showed, really in ways that expanded the terrain of inclusion or enhanced rights, at least from the perspective of the state, that had to be seized from below. The tension between the conservatizing pull of politics from above and the expansive and liberatory pull of politics from below was very evident during the AIDS pandemic. The second way in which we have seen the social addressed, I think, in our public politics is around the national question, around the discussions of race and the persistence of racism. And I'm not going to go into the politics of the student movement here, but because I think we're all familiar with it. So those are two dominant tendencies, right? I think there's another trajectory that intersects with that, that is actually rooted in a different kind of set of demands and issues. And that is the trajectory that comes out of the gender politics of women's movements. So to link to the questions that feminists raise about the social that I laid out a minute ago, in the South African history of women organizing, the question of the social, I would say, has been absolutely central. What might a society that is just and fair to women look like? that is a question that really animated women's political activism in South Africa throughout the 20th century. And you know, elsewhere, I've tried to read these political campaigns and read, for example, the two women's charters that were crafted in the 20th century, 1954 and 1994. And what we can see there are the fundamental questions that were being posed by women, but not recognized as fundamental in the political system as a whole, understood to be questions that were specific to women, special interest conditions, but I want to reframe them as actually fundamental questions about the social that should engage everybody in society, and definitely should engage everybody wanting a more just South Africa. So what were those questions? The questions that were asked in those charters and in those movements were, what kind of futures do we want to create? How can we displace current models of accumulation and patterns of distribution? How will we deal with the anxieties of those who hold on to hierarchies of power, whether those are of class, race, sexuality, or gender? In the women's charters, we can see how the concept of equality was posed not as one of formal rights only, not as one of representation only, but more broadly in three crucial respects. The rights of women to full participation and representation was important, but that domain of rights was expanded to include the private sphere, to include notions of sexual and reproductive autonomy within the scope of human rights. So in those charters, we see how there is a connection between the social and the political in ways that don't actually reproduce the heteronormative, idealized fantasy of family and community that are, you know, in a way go well beyond some of the discussions in decolonial debates that are taking place in South Africa, which kind of play with that line between the past and the present differently and the future differently. Those charters challenged the false universalisms of nationalism and Marxism and articulated forms of social justice in which care and reciprocity were demanded of everyone. That was not just a way of redistributing the burdens between state, society, and market, but was a way of redistributing burdens of care within households and communities, between the members of households and communities. So what we had, I think, by the time we reached the moments, the sort of transition period, was a very capacious and utopian vision, under-recognized and undervalued, and showing, in fact, in the course of the 20th century, this incredible capacity to learn and to be inclusive, so that you see the inclusion of queer rights in the 1994 Charter, which to me marked this capacity for openness to radicalism in gender circles. Some traces of these approaches made their way into the design of policies after 1994. So if you look, you know, at the white paper, 1997 white paper on social welfare, you see some of the policy documents that flowed from it. You see very clearly that welfare, as it was understood, I mean, there are a number of feminists, I should say, participated in the design of these policies, that welfare was articulated as an issue of justice in the first instance, rather than primarily or purely as a means of addressing the social needs of the poor, right? So there was a shift away from a kind of welfarist notion to a justice-based notion. And you can see the ghosts of this earlier radicalism in that early period after democracy, which was in, for example, the design of the expanded public works program, in which home-based care was made a legitimate form of work for claiming under the public works scheme. You could see it most lastingly, you can see it in the centering of the child rather than the mother in the child support grant. You can see it in the stipulation in our welfare design that social security provisions should include queer people. All of those values, however, were at odds with the far more powerful traditionalist communitarian approach, which stressed the importance of the family as the central institutional location of caring, without thinking about how those tasks would be distributed inside the family. Those specificities were simply left kind of unresolved, left too much to the political will and the ideological perspectives of policymakers. And as we know, from about very quickly, 1996, 97, those policymakers shifted rightwards in very significant ways. So when that shift occurred, what we have is the removal from the sphere of alternatives of what was imagined in these women's charters and in the politics of poor women's movements, which was a set of possibilities for state-provided institutions of care, support for socialized programs of care, particularly for the very young and the very old, the building of a public health system in which people who are ill would be dealt with by professionals rather than being added to the burdens of women within families. So the commitment, the anticipated commitment, the cruel promise, if you like, that seemed to be offered in the elaboration of something like a women-friendly state, for which South Africa was so well known in the 1990s, that was removed very quickly. That kind of notion of public provisioning was removed very, very quickly. And in fact, it continues to be the case, I think, that public provisioning of certain forms of supports, such as childcare and elder care, is considered to be of lower cultural value than family-based care. Now, I mean, I think there are some understandable and good reasons for this. There has been a long history of abuse of Black people in public institutions, and it's not easily displaced. You have a public system inherited from apartheid that barely met the needs of Black people. So a kind of concern with socialization of things like care. I don't think this is simply conservatism. I think there are some real historical reasons for that distrust. But it seems to me in the context of that history that any design of a democracy that claimed to be progressive or that claimed to be redistributive in any way would have to center the building up of public infrastructure in order to be meaningful, right? That there is this tradition of, this is, it seems to me, what the struggle for democracy was about. It was not about a quota of women in parliament. It was not about not just about gender targets in public policies, but it was about something much larger. And that is what did not happen after the 1990s. Now, it's true, there was massive electrification and expansion of housing in the first 15 years. But I think it's also true, we would probably agree, that it was inadequate in spread. It was weak in terms of building common infrastructure, right? So rich and poor remain, since 1994, remain spatially divided. New housing for poor people continues to be sited far from the urban core. There's no attempt kind of break into, let me put it, middle class enclaves, right? So there are, globally examples of democratization where, for example, any new private housing scheme is required to set aside a certain percentage of that housing to be made available at an affordable price for designated categories, such as teachers and nurses. We had none of that kind of experimentation. Public transport is very poor and tends to be utilized along class lines, right? Traveling to and from work for most people is via the public taxi industry. And where there is public transport, such as in the railways, traveling on trains, for example, is especially unsafe for women. So without going into the details, I want to just argue then that the path that was taken to democratization of the social through broad-based Black economic empowerment was not a democratizing path, and that what we have ended up with is a careless democracy. And by careless, I mean it in both senses, a democracy that is careless with the lives of people living in South Africa. Those lives have become ever more disposable. A kind of democracy in which we have turned, or the state and the elites have turned away from any collective responsibility for care as a public necessity and a public good, as a value that we will resource through the fiscus, through public institutions, and as well as through a set of normative values articulated in the public sphere. And there are many moments of break on the normative front. I put Jacob Zuma's rape trial as a major and decisive normative break, for example. And what we've seen since the mid-1990s has been the privatization and individualization of responsibilities returned to the usual others, right? The market, if you can afford it, and if you can't afford it, all of these things being placed onto women. So why didn't it happen? Why has the political empowerment of women? I mean, we might as well say the political empowerment of Black people as well. By the way, why has it not led to the kinds of impacts that were imagined on reducing inequalities and creating new and more inclusive social institutions? The first and most obvious reason, I've already alluded to, that all gender demands became collapsed into simplistic arguments for descriptive representation, that organizations on the ground became eviscerated as people went into the state and the bureaucracy. But I think the larger issue is that the kinds of expansive social programs that were imagined by women's movements, by trade unions, by poor people's movements were rendered politically and economically unfeasible under conditions of austerity. So they were rendered politically unfeasible in the sense that there was never a building of coalitions behind redistributive policies. There have not been strong coalitions built despite the existence of strong movements. I think there are, there are many social movements that care about the redistribution questions, but they tend to be delinked from elite politics. So that at the moment that we kind of instituted a democratic project, at the moment at which gender and racial equality is named as being central to a democratic project, at exactly that time, and in the same breath, the institutions that might give substance to redistribution were denuded of their capacity. So now we are we are in a moment in which we are back to crisis extraordinary. So yeah, to go back to Berland, to crisis extraordinary. Can this moment of the pandemic be a way in which to return to some of those central questions, to make those questions once again the space of public discussion, and make those questions the means by which we can craft new alliances in politics. I think, though, that in order to do that, we have to turn our attention to Berland's notion of crisis ordinary, to the lowercase drama, as they put it, of social life, in which there has been the slow and ongoing erosion of the normative fantasies of the good life, the kind of disassembling since the mid-1990s and of those few institutions that hold social life together, and the failure to invest in building up new social institutions that might hold us together. Right? Those are forms that Berland calls slow violence. They are mostly imperceptible in the present. And Berland's argument and their huge contribution to the debate is to say that the way in which we apprehend the breakdown or the sort of collapse of faith and of institutional capacity is by looking in the present at the affective structure of society, the feelings of anxiety and displacement. The affective structure, they argue, is the index of how subjects of the historical present, they say, register systematic and structural crisis in the ordinary. And I'm really intrigued by that formulation. Don't think Berland's overall formulation, which is centered on loss, is one that works for South Africa, because we never had strong public institutions underpinning the whole of society. But I do think there are two ways in which Berland's critique matters to us. The collapse of the belief in democracy is one, and the importance of grasping the meanings of public feelings is the other. So in relation to the first, right, the investment in a particular kind of liberatory fantasy, the sort of the non-racial dream that was embodied in the liberation movements, I think we have seen in the public sphere a set or an affective structure that Berland would characterize as anxiety expressed in rage, disillusionment felt most acutely by the generation who went to school in the Model C system and then went on to the elite universities, in which better education was held out as the glittery prospect of a better life, that there would be upward mobility and jobs and dignity and equality. But for that transitional generation, in which the models of prosperity were understood to be something like the idealized life led by white people under apartheid, they have not held out, right? Instead, that generation came into adulthood in an economy in which corporate networks still favored the networks between white people, despite affirmative action, in which there were relatively few jobs, in which there was tremendous instability, and in which they had to carry the larger burdens talked of in the public sphere as the black tax, right? So then the imagined notion of forming households, in any way based just on the distribution of your income within a small family doesn't hold, because you inherit a large number of other burdens. And that rage has been targeted, I would say, in the first instance, actually not at the failure of the state, oddly enough, not at the state led by the political party in which many are embedded, And in fact, for a small group of that generation, led by their very own parents, that has been displaced onto the idea of society itself. So it's been displaced on a rejection of the utopian notions of non-racialism, which at its core, I think, offered a radically alternative notion to what makes us human and to the interrelationality of people living in the same space. So something about that affective structure, it seems to me, deserves serious attention from us as analysts, not to dismiss them, but to try and understand that as an index of the kind of slow crisis of the social. The second point that I want to take from Berland's work is the way in which crisis extraordinary, which is mostly the crisis of the ANC, actually even more than the crisis of the pandemic, preoccupies us as political analysts in ways that overshadow crisis ordinary. The preoccupation with, I would say, with many parts of society, with elite, with the middle class, where large parts of our politics are centered on the articulation of rage, a preoccupation with the notion of having been sold out in some way, anger at earlier generations, the sort of ways in which earlier generations are treated as actors with full powers and agencies, right, that sold out the future. That seems to me really important. The centering of trauma as the language of the political, which Wahbi Long, pointed out in his really interesting book, The Nation on the Couch, reduces the social to the psychological, forces individuals to bear the weight of everything that ails them without looking at the social structures that shape them. That overdetermines social structure, and that individuals are simply seen to be at the mercy of systems of racism, sexism, and classism, while displacing any collective politics that might change the system, say, through defining the kinds of fiscal policies that would direct resources to address inequalities, and then systematically following these through social movements and political parties, and ensuring that politicians are held accountable for for their failure to implement commitments. So, as I've run out of time, of course, and I'm only about a third of the way through, but I want to say that out of that politics, what troubles me is that for many people in that younger generation, the state is neither worth fighting for, nor can it ever be directed to better ends, and the result is a kind of post-colonial melancholia. There's a kind of, and to use, again, to go back to Berland, this notion of solidarity, which is expressed only in terms of trauma and recognition of trauma, and the idea that we need to see each other's pain, Berland argues, is solipsistic. It doesn't really require us to act, or it conceives of action in very narrow terms, and in terms of the de-democratized digital subjects, as Wendy Brown would put it. So what is it that we need to do? I think that corruption and mismanagement has made us turn away from the public, has made us turn away from investing in the public things that are needed to make us a society. A justified distrust in state bureaucracy has made us assume that somehow corporate bureaucracies will be better. The collapse of everyday functionalities, water and electricity, for example, has resulted in many people reaching for solutions in the private that are seen to be more efficient out of a sense of despair. For example, beginning to talk about reducing the amount of taxes and rather privatizing those services, right? And, sure, we all want electricity, but I think the answer to our problem is not to exit the state, but to return our attention to the rebuilding of the public to the rebuilding to the building of the infrastructure, that the cost of turning away from the public is that it will destroy the very things that constitute us as a society. Because in the end, we are held together, I want to argue, we are durably held together, not through identitarian politics, but through the things that we build, the things that we use, the things that we maintain collectively that affect and constitute us as a collective. So the provisioning of public goods, the public infrastructures that we all need and use are what binds us together in shared spaces. And when that infrastructure crumbles, it is the constitutive gifts of the public sphere of stabilization, integration, and adhesion that collapse. So I want to return us to thinking about the public, or in some literatures, to thinking about the commons, as it is put, to refocus our attention on the things that hold us together. And I don't mean only ideationally, but infrastructurally, the expansion of the commons and the beginnings of forms of governance that will be more egalitarian, that will recognize that we do not all enter these institutions as equals, regardless of the formal structure of the state and the constitution. So some of the work that I have been doing with Beth Goldblatt has been to think about the way in which we might attach some of feminist investments in the protections that come from law and constitution, to not dismiss those, to not be flippant about those, but to see those as allies for radical democracy, right? To think about the parts of the constitution that defend our rights as women and queer people, that defend the social and economic rights of people as allies that could be mobilized politically, that could help us to craft the kinds of alliances we need for a different kind of society. So, just to end by returning to this persistent problem that really troubles me. I mean, even in my private capacity as a mother, the problem that girls aged 10 to 14 are having babies. I mean, what is that a reflection of? It is obviously a reflection of a social failure to protect children. It is tied to forms of masculinity in which female bodies are seen as men's entitlements, regardless of their age or their consent, makes us ask questions about how violence continues in households and how the pandemic and forms of response to the pandemic might have resulted in women and girls being exposed to greater degrees of violence. It makes us ask whether the collapse of frameworks of dignity and respect actually have something to do with the ways in which everybody is treated as disposable in a society that is so enclaved along racial and class terms. It makes us ask all of those questions. But the answers lie, I don't think, only in families and communities, right? In the question and answer in the Gauteng legislature, the government and the DA both turned to, as their answer to what needs to be done, we need to educate girls about how to say no. That's not the answer. That's the wrong answer. The right answer is that we need to rebuild the institutions that will allow people to feel like they are leading lives of dignity. What we need, in other words, is to rebuild humanity. And we need, therefore, what the ANC and the DA need to do is to look to themselves and their failures to build that kind of society, not to look to the failures of people already embattled, to their failure to secure their own dignity. I am well over time, so I'm going to stop and please ask more questions because I've got so much more to say. Thank you.
Thanks, Shireen. That was a theoretically rich presentation. It's interesting that you recenter the social at a time when governments are busy talking about social distancing as against physical distancing. I've heard Louis R. Gordon saying that one can't do away with the social. Even a virtual conference of this nature is an affirmation of the social. And that the war is being waged on the social by the neoliberals. So yeah, I'm pleased to hear you recentering the social. So colleagues, yeah, the floor is open. Yeah, we'll take 2 questions at a time. So there's a question from Chris Isike. In fact, it's a comment. Thanks for a well thought out presentation, Shireen. In many ways, you argue for the social state, which is by its nature and manifestation, is one that prioritizes human security. My concern is whether you can realize such a state in the context of the liberal and exploitative state system in Africa inherited, which has reproduced perverse notions of the governance. And then from Sally, does the current moment open up any possibilities for returning to the building of the public? COVID-19 has led to the expansion of grants and has made us underline the importance of public health. Has this moment increased the likelihood that South Africans will place more value on building the kind of state you favor?
Thank you very much, Bongani. Thanks, Chris, for that comment. I mean, I would say the first thing I would say is that it's not that we have to prioritize human security, but a word I would use is human flourishing instead, right? I think security signifies a whole sort of a linguistic regime that I'm not very comfortable with. So yes, one that prioritizes human flourishing, and that sort of is kind of, in sense terms, a system that Amartya Sen allows us to be fully the kind of people we want to be, right? That's really what we have to ask. But I would also quibble with you that what we have are liberal states. I think that's open to debate. Do we have a liberal state? We have a formal structure of a liberal state. We have, a design that is thinly liberal in the sense that we have many African countries in which we now have multi-party democracies and elections and so on. But we do not yet have a kind of respect for political rights of liberalism. So let me first make that distinction, something that I actually think is not dispensable with. I don't know that one can get away from liberal political rights. We do have exploitative state systems, but these are predatory systems. There are, could you really say that the ANC is presiding as a party of liberalism over South Africa? I don't think so. I think what is much more, what the kinds of words I would use to describe that are much more forms of, someone used the term extractive syndicalism. They're predatory. I think we need to use a whole range of other terms. I think it's a misplacement of problems when we make it about liberal democracy. At the moment, I live in a country that I would say is a liberal democracy, increasingly that was a liberal democracy, has become a bit more of a neoliberal democracy, in which, Sally, interestingly, to touch on your question, the pandemic has actually reopened a politics of concern for common goods. So it's interesting to see how it worked here. But of course, Canada had a long period of time in which it did build socialized systems and a socialized infrastructure that got dismantled under a conservative government, which, you know, was in power for a very long period of time. And there's been a sort of return in public discussions now to that rebuilding. For us in South Africa, of course, we have to build. It's not that we have a sense of loss about institutions that we had that were eroded by neoliberalism. We came into democracy with a very, which is what I was trying to say, with a very capacious vision. And then we had a set of policymakers who told us, it's not affordable. It's not going to happen. I think that's still open for a lot of discussion. I'm personally very, very pleased. I've participated in many panels and discussions over the last year and a half in which we have been talking about the basic income grant again, right? And where grants, the place of grants has returned as a question. The financing of public health has returned as a question. But we need to build the coalitions for that. It seems to me we still don't have powerful coalitions for that. We don't have left any more allies for that among the political party system either, I would say. Maybe I'm wrong. Perhaps someone wants to defend the DA, ANC, and EFF as being invested in that, but I don't see it in their responses to the crisis. I don't see the building of that space of political possibility. I see the demand being made by all kinds of other sectors, many of the movements of poor people like Abahlali and so on. I don't see it as something that is taken up in a systematic way by political parties. So whether this moment of crisis becomes a portal to something different or a form of closure, I think depends on how we respond to it. I worry, I guess what I was trying to underline is I worry about the way in which the middle class, the tax-paying middle class, is turning away from the public because of the weaknesses of the state.
So we have two more questions. Here's one from Nomphumelelo. You said something about drawing our attention to the public, but how do we do that when even the public has been critiqued for being exclusive? Some can go as far as to even say that the state and the constitution does not protect everyone. And she has a follow-up. I know I asked you this, but I'm interested to know, how do you suggest to think position women's politics in this time of crises? Would you like to respond now, or should I?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's a little bit about, it's a question that implies a certain notion of the public, right? I mean, you're absolutely right, Nomphumelelo. We do not have an inclusive public, right? We do not have, and again, the possibility that here in Canada I can have a very full life, safe and efficient life, simply relying on the public transport system, right? And it's a public transport system in which I'm as likely to encounter very rich people as I am to encounter very poor people. That's a particular sense of the public. That is, you get onto a subway car or a bus or a streetcar here, and you are in a public space in which we are all riding on that bus, invested in that bus, getting from A to B safely, efficiently, on time, and so on, right? So you're right that we don't have that. But I guess what I am saying is that we have to build it. That simply saying, well, we don't have it, doesn't mean that we turn away from the state. I'm asking us to recenter those projects as the projects of our politics. I'm not sure that kind of makes sense, but that's really, I think we're probably in the end agreeing that institutional failures have led to declining support for the public. And so the challenge that you raise is the same as the challenge I raise. How do we hold on to the idea of the public? That is about politics, it seems to me, and about I keep coming back to this, building coalitions. And I do think that those are coalitions of the poor and the middle class, not only the politics of poor people. I think, and if there's one thing the pandemic has shown us, is that if we do not pay attention to the needs of poor people, we are also going to be affected as rich people, right? I mean, viruses circulating in the way they do, not just within countries, but across the world, has a lot to do with inequality. So we should all be invested in equality.
There's a question. How do we hold on to the idea of the public whilst living in state failures? There's another question from Spokaz. She says, thank you, Shireen, for such a rich paper. I'm intrigued by the point you make about young people who feel betrayed by the state, relying on the politics of trauma and being unseen, that I heard you saying are not enough. Can you please say more about that? Secondly, how do we reconcile this public moment of even Afro-feminism in social media, for example, that is not accompanied by the kind of commitment to building movements that demand a better social infrastructure that made the two women's charters possible, for example?
Yeah, I mean, these feel to me like similar kinds of questions to the ones raised before. I mean, you know, so, you know, on the how do we think these possibilities in times of failure? Well, you know, history is replete with examples of people reaching imaginatively for something better, right? The charters are these utopian visions. People were living in appalling circumstances in which there was none of this infrastructure, and they were able to articulate and fight for that nevertheless. So that seems to me, again, to return to what, you know, what is the space of politics? How is it organized? Which issues are made issues of politics? Which issues are made of issues of contestation? How do we hold political parties accountable for what they say they are going to do? First of all, how do we impact on what they say they are going to do? And then how do we make them accountable for following through on those? Why do we not have more public debate about budgets? Why is that not, you know, why are those not the issues around which we come together? I mean, a lot of people who are studying those movements who will be better able to answer it. So if I'm avoiding it, it's because I don't know quite how we do it. I do feel very strongly that we need to bring back questions of what are our core priorities and how will we resource those priorities as the subjects of our politics. In saying that, I am not saying, of course, that the feelings of not being seen, the feelings of pain, hurt, anger, and so on are not important. I mean, I do think racism and sexism and homophobia are major problems in our society. I'm only saying that in the medium to long term, the way we get to a society in which we are seen, recognized, held together, is through recreation of a public infrastructure. So you know, I don't want to, Spokazi, I guess what I'm saying and why I'm wanting to bring the Berland work in here is because I think Berland really encourages us to think about those affective structures as a kind of a marker of something, not as false consciousness or simply hyperbole or hyperventilating, you know, but as actually as a kind of signifier of some kind of underlying set of problems. But the question is, how do we get beyond that? How do we begin to define what that project is? I think that's what I would want that conversation to be about. I have spent, I mean, like you probably on social media, we've been, our feelings have been engaged in a very ongoing, thoughtful, and often enlightening way on the case of, you know, a man who many feminists know who has been revealed to have been abusive, right? You know what I'm referring to. I want to see that kind of attention directed to the problem of the Charlotte Medical Care Hospital. That's, you know, I want to see a coalition building around that. I want to see us spending days and weeks worried about why 143 people can die in the privatization of care in Gauteng, how it is that the life Sidimeni issue, how did that happen? How did it happen under our gaze, under our watch? That's what I guess I want to say is should preoccupy us, because if it doesn't, if we don't start to think about that, then we, you know, it's in my, I guess I'm saying it's not abstract ideas entirely that hold us together. We can fight about what non-racialism is or isn't, means or doesn't mean, etc. In the end, if we're not doing the everyday work of building a public infrastructure, we won't be held together.
Okay, we have two more questions in the Q&A. One from Spamandla Zodi, president of SAAPS. What do you think about the narrative power and influence of the ANC on our society, enabling them to maintain electoral power, this ability to act like a critique today of its actions yesterday? And then another question from Desiree. I think we are facing a moment where there seems to be a privatization of the social coinciding with privatization of democracy, which is impacting on the commons and the ability to come together and participation of public. How do you see this?
Thank you, Spamandla. The narrative power and influence of the ANC. Well, I think there are many better placed people in this conference to begin to answer that. I've seen some of the panels, and even people, I'm sure Judith February and so on would have a lot to say about that. The narrative power and influence of the ANC, in fact, from what I can tell, is declining. And the problem is that there is no alternative. There's no other political party that is able to command narrative power and influence in anything like a hegemonic way, right? The ANC, the problem of the ANC is the problem of our country. But for me, I'm much more interested in what do we do in response to that? What could we, I don't want to get into a whole discussion about the ANC, its failings and its weaknesses, because I'm sure you've discussed that in many panels. 9 wasted years, but it was more, I guess what I'm also saying is it was more than 9 wasted years. I think we can trace a decline in its, so that at the moment in which it thought about democratization as being about expanding access to shares in companies and tenders and so on. That is when the wasted years began, right? That loss of that in the mid-1990s is where I would place it. Its problems. I don't think it was just Jacob Zuma. I think it's the party or the party under Zuma. I think it's a party of a longer period of time. And yeah, Desiree, absolutely, I agree with you. That's kind of the theme that I was wanting to pursue. And I would be interested in hearing how people think we can rebuild the social, or how we can rebuild the commons or expand the commons. So, you know, I would just say that as long as we have public hospitals where middle-class people don't go. So, you know, I'm thinking about the late, great Thandika Mkandawire, who always said, you know, policies that are made only for the poor are poor policies, right? That was his really useful insight into why we have to have public infrastructure in which rich and poor have to be users, that we have to be, the middle class and the rich have to use hospitals, because if we do use hospitals and schools and so on, then we will make them better for everybody, because we can then mobilize our class position, our voice, our agency, our resources, all of those things, right? And you know, the problem we are faced with is that the ANC has collapsed that space. The real problem for me in my reading, in this reading I'm giving you, the real problem of the ANC is that it failed to build that. It failed to invest in that. It underdeveloped all of that common infrastructure, so that it's now very hard. You know, be very frank, myself, would I go to the Joburg Gin if I could rather go to, you know, to the Mill Park Hospital? Probably not, right? That is a serious indictment. So how do we do that? The question is whether the horse is bolted. Is it too late? I'm an optimist. I always think it's never too late. It can't be too late.
Thank you, Shireen. That was brilliant. And also thanks to our colleagues, SAAPS members and other attendees. We have come to the end of the session, colleagues, and I fear that, you know, the session may end abruptly because of this webinar. So thank you, Shireen. Thank you, colleagues. We have come to the end of the session. See you in the parallel sessions. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.